I think that there are a variety of reasons for the lack of enthusiasm for the handling of the pandemic. And part of it is a lack of trust in science that has been very present. And at the beginning of the pandemic was sort of front and center. There was a mistrust. And we're seeing some of that now with vaccine hesitancy. So, the reasons for that are complicated, but I think it's fair to say that some of that rests on us in the healthcare system. We don't always do the best job communicating the reasons for our recommendations, and there are historical reasons. There's systemic racism, right? There are reasons why certain patient populations are much more reticent and suspicious about healthcare and things like vaccinations than there are political reasons.
Good evening. I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, From Outbreak to Pandemic, Year 2 and Counting, the inaugural program in our 6-week summer series, Politics in the Era of Global Pandemic 2.0, a survey course for everyone. This series is produced and co-sponsored by GBH Forum Network in partnership with Ford Hall Forum and Suffolk University's Political Science and Legal Studies Department. In the second edition of our Global Pandemic Survey course, students, faculty, and guest speakers will enter our virtual classroom and examine the issues at play in year 2 of the COVID-19 pandemic, from global infection rates to economic disruption and to our trust in our government. We'll offer a unique take on the politics of the global public policy response, present a diversity of perspectives on what the post-pandemic new normal will be, and we'll explore whether we will be better able and prepared for the next global crisis. I'm so happy you could join us this evening and do hope that you will join us for the other programs. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Christina Coolidge, a faculty member in the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. Christina?
Welcome everyone to what I can't believe is the second edition of Politics in the Era of Global Pandemic. Thinking about how far we've come or how far we have yet to go between where we were last year and where we are now is a Herculean task. And we have some amazing panelists who are going to help us figure out those events. So to think about and contextualize where we were and what we were talking about last summer as opposed to what we're talking about now, just a few things come to mind. Last year, we were still kind of hoping that we would return face-to-face in the fall. That clearly didn't happen. We certainly didn't know that women's unemployment or women's workforce participation would return to something more like 1970s levels. We were talking about mask hesitancy, not vaccine hesitancy. And we certainly were not thinking about infection rates and death rates as high as they are today. So we actually have a quick snapshot of what the state of the global pandemic looks like now, which is northward of 4 million deaths across the globe. In terms of vaccinations, roughly 24% of the globe has had at least one vaccination. But the real problem with that is the disparity in where those vaccines are going. Only 1% of the globe who live in low income countries have received those vaccinations. So one of the big messages here really is, although we may, if we are lucky enough to be in a place where we are either partially or fully vaccinated, begin to feel like we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, if we zoom out and look at this problem globally, we are still in the teeth of the pandemic. The point of this series really is to try and figure out what all of this means, how far we've come, how we got here, and what impact this will have down the road. So I'm super excited to introduce our panel tonight. We have public health experts, economics experts, and we also have a historian here who can talk to us about the very long stream impact of previous pandemics. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the fabulous Renuka Rayasam from POLITICO. Renuka, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Susan and Christina. Thank you so much for having us today and for doing this discussion. I think it's really, really important, and we have a great panel, as you mentioned, Christina. So I'm really looking forward to getting started. So let me introduce everybody that will be speaking today. We are going to start with Jonathan Haughton, who's the chair of economics here at Suffolk University. Jan Vogler, who is a political economist doing his postdoctoral research in the CLEAR Lab as a postdoctoral research associate in the political economy of good government at Virginia University. Dr. Helen Boucher, the chief academic officer and well-force infectious disease physician at Tufts Medical Center, where she's currently serving as interim dean. Sorry, at the University of Virginia. Jan, I apologize, Jan's at the University of Virginia. So Jan, Helen, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to jump right in, Helen, to talking about where we are in the pandemic right now. Can you set the stage for us a little bit? Because, we're in year 2 now. A lot of us, feel like we're out of this, but we're not. And I think, there's a huge disparity, as Christina mentioned, between where we are in the US and globally. So can you talk about where we are right now and talk about what might become our new normal, when it comes to this pandemic?
Well, Renuka, thank you for the lovely introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. As you mentioned, we're 16 months in now to this epidemic, and globally we have over 188 million cases and that over 4 million deaths, which is a number that I still have a hard time even beginning to digest. If we think about the United States, sadly, we continue to lead the way with the most cases approaching 34 million reported infections. We're followed closely by India that has 31 million reported infections, and that's likely a gross underestimate, as we know. And then Brazil with 19 million infections. As you think about it, and we look at the map from Johns Hopkins and other daily updates, there is no place on the globe that has not been affected by COVID. And that's one of the big messages, right? We're not going to get out of this until we're all safe. The travel that we do, the interconnectedness of our world really makes that apparent. And we'll come back to that. So the good news is we've had the gift of the miracle of vaccines that science have produced for us, right? The fact that the science of mRNA technology that's been being studied for a decade led to the availability of now 3 very good effective vaccines with 90% plus effectiveness in the real world. That has had a huge impact, as was pointed out, mostly in the developed world so far, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We know that in the United States, vaccines have saved over 280,000 lives and averted well over 1 million, and some estimates over 1.25 million hospital admissions. And to someone who works in a hospital, the vision of what we went through last spring, I don't think we'll ever get over, when we were almost overwhelmed with sick patients. So the good news is that we have vaccines and they work. The less good news is that uptake in our country where they are available has not been universal, and we now have outbreaks happening. And in fact, in the United States, we have over 100% increase in cases. The overall number is still low, but that should get our attention. Hospitalizations are up 20% in the last 2 weeks, and deaths are up 17%. So this Delta variant that's circulating is a concern. The vaccines still work, but not enough people are vaccinated. So that's the story of the United States. And I think the new normal is going to be seeing these hopefully little clusters and outbreaks. Globally, the problem is greater. We have whole countries with very little vaccine coverage. And until we get immunity to these places, none of us will be safe. So I think the new normal is that we have a new disease among us. I hope we don't see big outbreaks in the United States, but we still have work to do. And that COVID fatigue that you mentioned, Renuka, is a real concern to all of us on the front line, because we're tired, but this virus is not tired of us. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one quick follow-up there. I mean, about the variants and the science of this. So, we have the Delta variant, and the studies and the data has shown that if you're vaccinated, you're still protected from hospitalization and death if you get this variant of COVID. I mean, how worried are you about variants emerging that can evade vaccine defenses right now? Because I feel like that's the big scary thing, right?
Well, we're concerned about virus circulating, right? So if we look at the southeast areas that are experiencing the surges right now, the concern is that that transmission could lead to the emergence of another variant that indeed is more effective at evading immunity, evading vaccines. So again, the need to get out there and help people want to get vaccinated and get the vaccine to where people are has never been greater.
Jonathan, talk about the impact. I mean, I know we all feel this individually, the psychological impact, the personal impact, but talk about the impact of this pandemic on our society and our economy. I mean, we just saw these enormous, huge societal shifts, what essentially felt like overnight. And can you talk about that? Can you talk about, how this pandemic has affected all of us?
Well, indeed, I think there are lots of ways of slicing this particular cake. In 2019, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, projected that world GDP would grow by 2.5% in 2020. And instead, it actually shrank by 4.3%. Now, when you then add up those numbers, that represents a loss of about nearly $6 trillion.
Oh, wow.
And add roughly the same amount in 2021, that's this year, we're talking at least $10 trillion. The US GDP is a little over 20 trillion, but by any standards, that is an enormous loss. Now, that's only a very aggregate number, and it's a partial number. So what that average hides is, thank you, this is exactly the slide we want to look at first, is that the impact differs enormously depending on the country. So what you see here is the GDP losses anticipated for the US, because we're going to make up some of the lost ground next year probably. So the US will be down maybe 5%, according to the G30 report led by Larry Summers that came out just recently. But in emerging and developing Asia, the drop is equivalent to about nearly 40% of GDP. That's driven by South Asia more than anything else. But the pandemic has not spared Indonesia or Malaysia is now getting it. And even China has actually been hit more than you might expect, because China is strongly linked with the rest of the world and has closed its borders in some substantial ways. So this nobody's untouched, even countries with fairly modest rates of exposure. But that's not all, because the cost is not just a matter of dollars and cents. There's a slide that was, that's a little table that shows the breakdown of costs that tries to put some sort of measure, not just on the loss of GDP, but also on the health costs. Now, how do you put a value on life lost? Well, you can't, but you can put a value on a statistical life. And so what David Cutler and Larry Summers did back 6 months ago was they said, let's take the number of deaths in the US and value each death at $7 million. And that's where they came up with this $4.4 trillion number. Now, Helen said that about 4 million people have died so far. But about a month ago, The Economist did a study where their estimate is deaths are about 10 million worldwide. And what they do is they don't look at the number of people who are actually reported as dying of COVID. They look at the mortality rate this year compared to mortality rate last year or in a typical year. So they're looking at excess mortality, and That's where they come up with those numbers. And so we know that the underestimation of deaths, it's probably only 7 or 10% in the US, but it's a factor of 2 or 3 in a number of countries. So if we look at the numbers, we can put a value, I suppose, on deaths, but also about a third of those who are hospitalized will have long-term health problems, as far as we can tell. And the quality of life that they face will be lower. And so economists and other health policy experts try to measure the quality of life cost. And that adds another few trillion. And then you can, and then there are just the additional costs of treating people, plus also the mental health costs. It's estimated that in a typical year pre-COVID, about 10% of Americans really needed some type of mental health counseling or support, and that the figure now is closer to 40%. And if that number is even partially true, that's a gigantic jump, and it's a jump that requires, that has a real cost attached to it. So these costs are really quite gigantic. And the irony is that although the US leads the world in reported deaths, we are probably one of the countries that will have, in the end, one of the lower economic costs. So we need to remember that the rest of the world is hurting really quite seriously. We could go on and talk about other differential impacts, but I think that might get us started with this.
Well, I wanted to just kind of quickly follow up with, you talk about death and healthcare impacts that that translate to those costs, but just in terms of employment, I mean, can you quickly talk about our labor force has seen this and just enormous shift, and that's that's an important aspect of this as well, just women dropping out of the workforce. I don't know if you can kind of briefly talk about some of those as well.
Yes, well, about a year ago, unemployment had rocketed up. I mean, it rocketed from about 5% to 14% in the course of a month. What's interesting is that actually was fairly temporary, and that since then the US economy has been creating jobs. Now, what happens is that when jobs are lost, some people stay in the market, they're looking, and others give up looking, at least for now. And disproportionately, this was the case in the US anyway, of women. The argument that's often given is that childcare support systems and sort of collapsed, and women, for better or for worse, are in most households the primary supporters of children. So women were disproportionately hit. Now, what has happened is it's taken about a year to get back to a point where jobs are now becoming fairly easily available. But it takes a while for people to go back into the labor force. And that's partly because there's a lingering anxiety about going to work, especially if you have to go to the office, and then you may bring infection back to your family. And there's also continued problems with supporting children at home. Mm-hmm. So I think that while the jobs are increasingly there, the labor force has been a little bit reluctant to go back into it. But I'm relatively optimistic. So my sense is that if we continue on the current trajectory, by the end of the year, we'll be back to pre-COVID employment levels. That would be my estimate.
Next, I wanted to talk to you, Jan. I mean, your research is so fascinating, and it looks at the impact of the Black Death on Europe. And there's a lot of historical parallels we can kind of make when it comes to the pandemic. So talk about your research a little bit, what you learned about the impact of the Black Death on Europe, and how that compares to what we're facing today with the modern pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Renuka, first of all, for moderating, and also thanks to the organizers for inviting me. My research, which is a collaboration with Dan Gingrich at the University of Virginia, looks at the historical impact of the Black Death. And I would just first like to provide a little bit information on that, because I assume that not everyone in the audience is familiar with the Black Death. So the Black Death was the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history, and it affected not only Europe, but also Asia, where it likely originated is what we believe, also the Middle East and North Africa. Our most reliable data is on Europe, though, and it is estimated to have killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population at the time.
At what time period? Over what time period?
So it is also debated among historians, but it was approximately 4 to 5 years that it lasted in Europe. So what we find in our research, in my research with Dan Gingrich, is that the Black Death really had comprehensive and long-lasting effects. In terms of its impact, it can only be compared to the world wars, I believe, so that would be an adequate comparison. And I think I will go into a little bit more detail on this later in the conversation when it comes to the specific impact it had on workers at the time and on politics. But you also asked, how does it compare to the current pandemic? And I believe we have a graph that we can put up. Yeah, that's it. First of all, there are some commonalities or some similarities between the two pandemics. But I would also like to emphasize, and I will talk about this in a moment, that the differences far outweigh the similarities. But I think in the interest just of making this historical comparison, let us just walk through some of the similarities. So like a lot of pandemics, there was spatial divergence in severity. And that means some areas are hit a lot harder, some areas are hit less hard. This has to do with geographic conditions, with population density, with climatic conditions, also, of course, where the pandemic originates. So in general, in this pandemic and in the Black Death, we see a lot of spatial divergence. We also see, and this often comes with pandemics, economic disruption at a massive scale. As I will talk about in a moment in terms of the differences, the reason for the economic disruption is a different one, though, between the Black Death and COVID-19. What might be an interesting thing to know about is what we have seen recently, especially in the United States, is a rise in anti-Asian racism and attacks on Asians because they are blamed for COVID-19. And this is not a new phenomenon. So already in the 14th century, when the Black Death hit Europe, there was discrimination against certain minority groups. And in this case, it was the Jews who were primarily blamed. And of course, they served as a scapegoat. So they were even blamed and killed in some cases in areas where the Black Death never hit or never really hit hard. So as in this pandemic, people look for scapegoats and look for someone they can blame. Also, most pandemics have some political effects. In our research, we find that the political effects of the Black Death lasted for centuries. I don't think that will be the case here with the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe Trump would have had a better chance at getting reelected if he had not done so poorly when it comes to the COVID response, which I think really swayed the vote of a lot of voters. Now, let me talk about the differences too. And as I mentioned, I think those really outweigh the similarities. I think our modern societies are much, much better prepared to understand and to respond to a pandemic. And that is because we have the medical knowledge, we have the technology, we also have the administrative capacities and the understanding. And communication technologies are also very important to transmit information that we have about the pandemic. The social and economic context in which these two pandemics hit is also very different. Europe in the 14th century was a very agricultural society. There was a little bit manufacturing, but of course our society is economically so much more advanced. It's really difficult to compare these two. And what I think we also have to keep in mind is that the economic disruption that we observe today is primarily caused by the response to the pandemic, actually. COVID-19 has a comparatively low death toll, and that is also my final point. The death toll is just at a completely different level with the Black Death, killing 30 to 60%. We don't have a precise number, but these are our estimates. And that just is a pandemic at a much, much greater magnitude. The current pandemic, its economic effects are primarily caused by the government response. And that is something important we have to keep in mind when we compare these two.
Helen, I wanted to talk about, maybe it's a bit premature to talk about the next pandemic, but are there lessons we've learned about pandemic preparedness from these past 16, 17 months? Do you think that we're prepared if another pandemic like this were to come up in 20, 30, 40 years?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, we have to think about the next pandemic. And there are other other slower pandemics around us already. I work in the area of antibiotic resistance, which many call a silent pandemic. So that is with us. And some of us, I've been working in preparedness for many, many years. And I very much hope we'll learn lessons from COVID. But you alluded to this earlier, Renuka. People are getting tired. They're fatigued. Washington is moving on to the next thing, the next health problem to focus the expenditures on. And so we need to think about infrastructure, both for science and for public health. We need to think about the science to develop countermeasures, vaccines and medicines, right? The technology that led to the mRNA vaccines didn't just start a year ago, it started a decade ago in preparedness for another disease, the SARS virus, right? So we very much hope, I very much hope that we won't forget and that the investments will be made and the finances, since this is an economic group, that there will be funds allocated to the infrastructure, the people, the science and technology that are needed to be ready for the next pandemic. And it is clear that there will be one. It's not clear when, but I think very, very hopeful that we'll learn from this and we will not have such short memory.
Is there, is there something, if there one or two things that policymakers could focus on that you think that they should be doing, they're not doing right now in Washington? Or, I don't know if we've learned so much about the importance of our local public health departments that were so underfunded. And I don't know if it's something as basic as, contact tracing and things like that, or if there's more about research and technology with detection and genetic sequencing and vaccines. But I don't know, you have some thoughts on what policymakers should be focused on to prevent the next one?
Yeah, I think the public health infrastructure in a broad bucket, that includes the workers to do the public health work at the local, state, and national level. That includes things like contact tracing, but also surveillance, right? We're only going to be as prepared as what we know. So this was a great lesson in the need for surveillance. Things like wastewater, looking at our wastewater for viruses and bacteria. That kind of work costs money and we need people to do it. So that's very important. And then on the other side, on the countermeasure side, that's the investment in the technology and the people to develop the vaccines, the medicines, and the diagnostic tests so that we're prepared. I would say that's two broad areas that we really have to focus on.
That's interesting. Jonathan, we saw during this pandemic, the US government passed trillions in dollars in new spending. It was seen as, just unthinkable maybe a couple of years ago. Some of that's starting to fade away, like these enhanced unemployment benefits. Some are just starting, like the child tax credits. Do you think there'll be lasting policy changes from this pandemic? And I know you talked a little bit before about, in previous conversations, about the 1918 flu pandemic and how that didn't really have any lasting kind of policy changes. But do you think that, this COVID pandemic will have lasting policy changes?
My general sense is that the lasting effect will be very small. And I take as my cue for this what I think is the most interesting historical parallel, which is the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. About a third of the world population caught that flu. Yeah. About 20 million people died. That was over 1% of the world population. India, by the way, was particularly hard hit. The current pandemic has maybe killed 1/6 of 1% of the world population. And while it's certainly not over, it's not yet really of the same magnitude of the Spanish flu. And what happened? Well, my grandmother caught the flu in 1918 and was sent to relatives in Ireland to recover, and she did recover. But what's interesting is that at the time, people were doing what we did. They were wearing masks like this. They were told to open the windows, to not use common drinking cups, to cover their mouth when they sneezed, and stay at home if they could. This photograph and these instructions come from Connecticut newspaper 103 years ago. But if it appeared in the Boston Globe a year ago, it wouldn't have been out of place. But what's extraordinary is that that terrible pandemic has been largely forgotten. It had almost no political effects. It had little effect on spending on science. And so the question is, what's different this time around? This table simply goes through pandemics that we've had over the past 130 years. And the Spanish flu was by far the worst. But you can see that in a number of years, 1 to 4 million people have died because of pandemics that have been somewhat localized. And in a typical year, 500,000 people die of seasonal flu. So none of these things are absolutely new. What we have is a particularly nasty case. So back to your question, are there things that will fundamentally change? I think the one thing that that will change over the next 5 years anyway, is that we'll spend more on the science. Medical science has gained in credibility enormously, and it's gaining in funding, not just in the US, but in lots of countries. And that's important, because even if the US politically takes more steps backwards in the future, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Indians, the South Africans, and so on, will be making investments as well. And there's a certain healthy competition, maybe for the wrong reasons, but with the right outcome, which I think will help us tackle pandemics pretty quickly again in the future. But why do I say only 5 years? Because memories fade, people forget. It's interesting, when there's a flood in an area, people go out and they buy flood insurance. But within 5 to 7 years, only about 20% of those people still have flood insurance. So it's the same attitude. We forget, we move on, we have other priorities. And so my sense is we're going to put this behind us. Besides, we don't want to think about it. We want to be in denial because it's psychologically much easier. And it may even be healthy to try to move to denial. It may actually reduce a great deal of the stress that we feel. And while it may not solve future pandemics, it may actually be the right way to move.
That's interesting. I always think sometimes maybe when I'm an old lady and my grandchildren will make fun of me for wearing masks, but maybe not. It sounds like maybe that's not going to happen. So
I'll make fun of you, but maybe not for wearing
exactly for lots of other reasons. Jan, I want to give you the last question before we turn it over to our students, which is about, kind of looking ahead. Can you talk about the long-term impact of the Black Death when it comes to urbanization, worker power, and other aspects of society at the time? And, thinking about those historical parallels, have you thought about, how that might inform whether the pandemic has a lasting imprint on the country and the globe?
Yeah, so in my research project with Dan Gingrich, we find that the Black Death really shaped European history in a very fundamental way. And its impact really lasted for centuries. And let me just elaborate a little bit on why it did have this impact. I think that's important to understand. As I mentioned, there was a spatial divergence in how hard some areas were hit. Some areas were hit very hard, others much less hard. And the areas that were hit hard, in those areas, because so many people had died, the value of labor went up dramatically. Suddenly there was a shortage of workers. And what that meant was that the lords that, were in a hierarchical relationship with these workers, who actually controlled them and dominated them, had done so for centuries in the system of serfdom, now had to compete for the workers. And what happened was, as a consequence of that, a lot of workers fled from their manors and a free labor market emerged. And the consequence of that was, among others, that there was a greater level of urbanization, technological innovation. And the Black Death is generally seen as having created this major transformation, especially of Western Europe and Western Germany, that had further consequences. Now, what we show in our research, and I think this is an important addition to the literature, is that also led to a comprehensive transformation of political institutions. The workers gained more opportunities to self-organize. I think we have a slide on that. the peasants suddenly, in many cases, were not subject to the control of the lord anymore, managed themselves, governed collectively, organized themselves collectively, and were able to also defend these rights they had gained, as is manifested in the German Peasants' War from 1524 to 1525. So the Black Death really changed the patterns, socioeconomic patterns, but also changed political institutions in quite a dramatic way. And what we show in the paper is that this spatial divergence, in part because of Germany's highly decentralized organization, lasted until the 19th century. And you can still see that the political cultures, this divergence in political cultures that was created by the Black Death, lasts until then. We show that in 1870s Germany, the Conservative Party does a lot more poorly in the areas that were hit hard because that was an anti-democratic party. And these areas had a long history of democratic participation. And maybe more stunningly and more importantly is that also the NSDAP, the Nazi party, as an also extremely anti-democratic party, did a lot more poorly in those areas that had a long democratic tradition. So the Black Death had profound and long-lasting consequences for political institutions and political traditions in Central Europe. Now, the second part of your question was about what can we learn about the current pandemic, right? And as I pointed out earlier, there are a lot of differences between the two. And I think I agree with Jonathan here that the imprint of the current pandemic will be a shorter one. But I also think maybe the most important lesson for us is that we now have the administrative, the financial, and the technological capabilities to prevent pandemics from becoming as bad as this one got. And it is really more about political will. Do we have the political will to use these financial, administrative, and technological capacities? And I think that's an open question that we might have to answer in a discussion that is about to come.
That is that's interesting. Well, there's a lot to cover. I'm going to wrap up there because I'm going to get to our student Q&A, which I'm really excited about. And so we have, I think, 4 students from Suffolk University that are incoming students that are going to step in to ask their questions. So let me start with Martin Wyndham. So I'll let you have the floor to ask the first question to our panelists.
Thank you, Renuka. I'm Martin Wyndham. I am an incoming freshman at Suffolk with the intended major of law. And my question is for Dr. Boucher. Dr. Boucher, it's quite known that some Americans are not satisfied with the way that the government handled this pandemic. I was wondering, in your professional opinion, what do you think some of the contributing factors to this were, as well as, God forbid, we have another pandemic, how you think we can do better?
That's a really great question, Martin. And I think that there are a variety of reasons for the lack of enthusiasm for the handling of the pandemic. And part of it is a lack of trust in science that has been very present. And at the beginning of the pandemic was sort of front and center. There was a mistrust. And we're seeing some of that now with vaccine hesitancy. So, the reasons for that are complicated, but I think it's fair to say that some of that rests on us in the healthcare system. We don't always do the best job communicating the reasons for our recommendations, and there are historical reasons. There's systemic racism, right? There are reasons why certain patient populations are much more reticent and suspicious about healthcare and things like vaccinations than there are political reasons. And we're seeing some of that play out. You might have seen in Tennessee that they fired their vaccine leader allegedly for her outreach to children to get them vaccinated. So they're complicated, I would say, human, scientific, and political reasons.
Adam Marotta, I think, is our next student who's up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Renuka. My name is Adam Marotta, and I'm calling from Wyndham, New Hampshire right now. And I'm going to be an incoming freshman at Suffolk this fall, and I'm going to be studying advertising. My question is for Dr. Vogler. So throughout the past year, it seems as though people have begun to lose hope as the weeks have progressed into months. In the article, How History's Deadliest Pandemic Shaped Politics in Central Europe for Centuries, you discuss how there was economic and social growth in the midst of the Black Death pandemic. My question to you is, should this idea of political change and increased freedoms give us hope that we will come out better on the other side of this ordeal?
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam, for this question. So as you said correctly, so first of all, the Black Death did cause a lot of economic disruption, right? But what happened afterwards was a long period of wage gain for workers. We also saw higher levels of technological innovation, urbanization. And so in many ways, the world that was inherited by the survivors of the Black Death was a better one than the world they had lived in before, especially for the lower socioeconomic groups of society. COVID-19 seems to have, at least in the short run, a different effect. And that is that it seems to have increased inequality, or I shouldn't say it seems, it clearly did increase inequality. The United States has a two-tier labor market to begin with, where we see greater distinctions between people with and without a college degree than in most other advanced economies. And these distinctions, this inequality was amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was largely because the groups that had a college degree often were able to keep working and were not, their jobs were not as strongly affected by the pandemic as those that had no college degree. So I think there's one silver lining though. So first of all, not only are we now on the way back to higher levels of economic growth, but I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has also done is it really has raised awareness, and that is important. It has raised the awareness for socioeconomic inequalities and also racial inequalities. And I think this greater awareness of the public, I'm not sure if it will last for a very long time, but at least at this moment, it seems to have a positive effect on people rethinking, can we maintain these high levels of inequality? Can we maintain this healthcare system that has a lot of problems and also unequal access across socioeconomic groups? And I think if there's a silver lining, it is this one, right? So let's hope that people will, remember this for some time, and that will change political attitudes and behavior.
A great question. Next, we have, is it Polina Petrova on to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. I'm Polina Petrova, like you said, and I'm a rising junior here at Suffolk University, and my major is political science with concentration in law and public policy. And I actually have a question for you, Renuka. You've been a journalist in many different places in the US and are also a student of international affairs. So I'm curious to find out your perspective about something that has surprised me regarding the pandemic. I personally thought that this global pandemic would unite people at home and nations around the globe, since we're all facing the same crisis. But that really hasn't happened. Instead, divisive politics, polarization, economic inequality, lack of cooperation have increased, which caused more suffering. And in your work on reporting on politics in the pandemic, did this also surprise you, or was it pretty much what you expected? And also, have you reported on anything that might give me reason to hope that we can act more collectively going forward?
I definitely think the trends have shown this, deep political polarization and, between urban areas and rural areas, and just shown how we cluster when it comes to things like education, where we live, where we work. And that is becoming more and more true. You've seen this huge difference between people who have a college education and their beliefs about vaccines and people who don't. And a lot of the splits that we've seen politically over the past years has been related to all of these demographic factors. And there's a lot of data showing how we sort of self-select into these areas and, self-select into places like San Francisco or New York or Idaho. And so, definitely those are trends we've seen in terms of how people vote. But I have been, and I continue to be totally shocked by when it comes to even something like masks, masks are annoying, but they're definitely not like a life-changing thing, and how much polarization we saw around that. And I think, and now with vaccines, which it makes a little bit more sense because we've always had a little bit of that hesitancy, and vaccines are hard to understand, and it's a shot and all of that. But definitely those have been able, you've seen that, you've seen doctors and scientists overcome those hurdles. And as Dr. Boucher mentioned with Tennessee, to see the health department take the step where they are just like, we're not going to do any outreach about any childhood vaccinations, forget about COVID. I mean, that was just an eye-popping step. And I think I like to be hopeful, but to me, I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing is social media, and social media has really intensified that clustering. So not only is it, who we're encountering at the grocery store or in our everyday lives, but who we see on social media, and those algorithms are meant to kind of feed your own biases and even with media habits in terms of who's reading the New York Times and who's reading, who's watching Fox News. And I think we have all of these reinforcing mechanisms now. So whatever your belief system is, you gravitate towards that media, you gravitate towards that social media post, you gravitate towards those locations and those workplaces and those life choices. And I don't know how those get overcome. I don't have that answer, but I definitely see it. I definitely see it intensifying because of all of these factors. So, but I'm a hopeful person, so I believe change is always there, and maybe not now, but at some point, we'll become galvanized to act more collectively in some of these huge societal issues. So, okay, we have one more student, Jamie Snow. I'm going to let you have the floor to ask your question.
Thank you so much. So, as Renuka said, my name is Jamie Snow. I'm going to be an incoming freshman for Suffolk University in the fall, and I am majoring in biology. And my question goes for Professor Haughton. So in the past year, in this pandemic, it highlighted that many of our minimum wage workers are necessary to keep our economy going, such as food workers and the like. These individuals who necessarily did not get a break, nor were they given the option to work from home like a few professions allowed their workers. And this showed us that these are essential workers during this pandemic, and they are among the lowest compensated, as they aren't necessarily in a job that our society deems as in great prestige, if that's the correct wording. So in your opinion, or what you would suggest, are there any actions that our society can take to address this undervaluation and the disparities that these essential workers face?
I'm not sure that I would characterize most restaurant workers as essential workers, at least not in the way that I would apply it to many health workers. But they are doing jobs that we appreciate. And absolutely they bore perhaps the brunt of the employment effects because we stopped going out to eat, and we stopped going to see theatre and dance and all sorts of areas where the workers are relatively poorly paid. One of the things that Jan noted, and it's sort of well known, was the Black Death raised the wages of workers. And that's not surprising, because now, instead of having 2 workers per field, you had 1 worker per field, and everybody was competing for that labor. We don't yet quite have that situation in the US. So I think what happened was, during the pandemic, the government spending in the US at least supported a lot of people. It enabled them to get by more or less, even if they didn't have work. In some cases, it was even generous enough that it may have delayed them returning to try to find work. But most of that is now over. So are we going to sort of rediscover the lower skilled labor force? I think the answer here is not related to COVID. I think we've gone, one major reason in my view for rising wage inequality in the US has been that over the past generation, we have opened up the world, especially to China. Remember, China in the early 70s was poorer than Africa. It was closed from the rest of the world. And somehow or other, we've managed to embrace and integrate 1.3 billion people into the world economy without it completely exploding. And what that has done is it has put pressure on low-skilled workers and their jobs. and has, in a sense, prevented the wages of the less skilled from rising. Now, China has been integrated. Wages are rising in China. They're not low anymore. It's not a low-cost place to make things. In fact, just a few years ago, I was in China and we visited Tibet, and many of the souvenirs that you buy of Buddhist art and so on are actually made in Nepal, not China, because they're cheaper to make in Nepal than they are in China. Now, the problem is, not a problem, but the truth is the world is beginning to run out of places where you can get cheap labor. And so within, I would say, about 20 years, we're going to find that we just don't have that pressure on low-skilled workers and on their wages. And so I would expect those wages to gradually begin to rise relative to the wages of the well-educated. It's a slow process, and it's difficult for government to hurry it along. But I do think that the recognition of inequality as a problem, I don't think that has anything to do with COVID. I think it predates COVID. I think COVID has made us look at inequality slightly differently. But this is the Black Lives Matter issues of income inequality. That goes back at least a decade, and to major books like Piketty's Capital in the 20th century. So that debate is much older. And we've gradually come around in the US to a view that was much commoner in Europe, which is that we need to be more proactive if we expect the incomes of the poorer part of society to be raised. And the child tax credit, which in many countries would be a children's allowance, is something that at the moment is temporary, but it if it could be made permanent, it could probably have child poverty. And I think there is a political will for that. And that would be an important lasting effect, because it's not COVID as such, but we experimented economically during COVID with these massive infusions of cash. We have a better idea that we can do it without the sky falling on us. And so I think we'll continue to do so. So my balance sheet here is a mixed one. I think the long-term effects on low-skilled workers are going to are slow, but things will improve. And I think politically and in policy terms, we're paying more attention, and that will help as well. Is that what you judge too, Jamie, or are you more pessimistic?
No, I do believe what you're saying. I think we are heading in the correct direction when it comes to getting everyone on the same playing field in a sense. But yes, it's slow but steady, but we are getting there. So I do agree with you.
Yeah.
I want to.
The thing is, by the end of the year, if we have unemployment down to about 5%, that does great things for low-income wages.
Thank you so much, students, for your great questions. They were all really wonderful. So wonderful having you on. I wanted to make sure, because we just have a little bit of time left, that we get to some audience questions. And Jan, I wanted to ask this question first because it's a follow-up to Jamie's question about income inequality. And we saw increases in wealth in the top 1% in the pandemic, and recently lots of people thrown into poverty. Can you talk about the shift in global wealth and the impact? The question is specifically about the impact on the middle class, and I thought you might be able to follow up to what Jonathan was talking about.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, one part of that question was also what can be done about this. Is that right?
Right.
Right. So let me just speak to. So certainly, let me just go back one more time and emphasize something very important. a key distinction between this pandemic and past pandemics is that our system of government, our administrative capacities of government have expanded massively. And we actually do have, at least theoretically, now the ability to respond to these growing inequalities. And it is a little bit more about political will, right? So I have no doubt that this pandemic has increased inequality, and we generally live in a time of inequality. The question is, will the change in awareness of these issues lead to a change in political will? And one thing I have to say is, we live of course, most of us live in democracies, many here in the United States. And democracies are known for moving very slowly, right? They are systems that are designed, that are by design slow moving, and in which the aggregation of preferences of people can take a long time. And they are designed in such a way so as not to fundamentally contradict the interests of any specific group. And that can be very frustrating, right? Because sometimes these political processes take a long time. What I hope is that we walk out of this pandemic and not only having become more aware of inequalities, but also with the will to change them. And I think that needs to be reflected not only in voting behavior, but if people really want to change something, they also need to become politically active themselves, right? So we have seen in recent decades many NGOs emerging, non-governmental organizations in which people lobby for specific outcomes. And we know that the business lobby is a very strong one. Business have strong representatives. Maybe it is time for citizens to become active like that too, and actually create organizations that have the long-term goal of making changes to these inequalities, and that pursue them actively, knowing that democracy is a long game that involves a lot of difficulties in pursuing interests. Yeah.
We have a lot of really good questions, so I'm going to try to condense them. I wanted to throw this question to Dr. Boucher, because it's actually something I'm really curious about. I mean, have there been techniques that have been successful in convincing others to get vaccinated? I don't know if if you have a sense of what works and what's been effective.
Yeah, so great question. And there are a lot of different strategies that have been employed, and there is some data, right? So meeting people where they are, listening, and providing good access are key, right? So that means engaging community leaders, religious leaders, education leaders in neighborhoods to really help people, especially from the groups we know are going to have greater hesitancy. So people of color, for example. So that works. The other thing that works is in my department, and that is physicians. So it is proven that if your physician, your primary care doctor says, it's time for your COVID vaccine today, I'm going to give you your COVID vaccine, it's very rare that a patient will say no to that. So that means that we have to bake it into what we do every day. We don't get paid for that. Physicians don't get paid for that. And so that's another kind of perversity of our healthcare system, that in our fee-for-service model, this kind of work is not compensated, but it works. And so there are a lot of efforts going on at primary care levels to really engage frontline physicians in these efforts. What doesn't work? Lotteries, famous people going on TV and telling you to get vaccinated. The studies really show that those measures are not as successful as much as we wish they were.
Oh, interesting. Because, Olivia Rodrigo is at the White House today, and one of our reporters actually interviewed Juvenile because he did this video about getting vaccinated for Black communities. But it sounds like you're saying that those are less effective than these one-on-one conversations. Yeah,
that's what the data would suggest. I'm not dissuading anybody from working on this, because I think it's going to take multiple layers to make progress.
Yeah.
Well, if I might just weigh up on this, I'm in France at the moment, and just a few days ago, the French government said that they are going to require everybody to have what they call a pass sanitaire, which is basically a QR code on your phone. Mm-hmm. By mid-August, will not be allowed to go into a restaurant, a supermarket, a bar, unless you have a QR code that shows that you've been vaccinated. Now, and if you are found, you will be fined about 150 euros each time. You won't be able to get on a train. You won't be able to go on the subway. So it's an experiment on a large scale of basically aimed, of course, at trying to get to the roughly 50% of French who, like the 50% of Americans, don't want to get vaccinated. This is not just an American thing, absolutely not. This is a worldwide suspicion of vaccination. Now, it's whether this is going to work, I think, is an open question. There's political will to put it in place, but there may not be political will to enforce it. That's a very typical thing in France. But we'll see. And already there are protests. Today is the French National Day. It's Bastille Day. And in most of the main cities in France, there were groups of people protesting the proposed rules, saying it was an affront to liberty. Again, same debate as in the US. So I think that this debate has to be worldwide, at least where people are free enough to be able to express it. If we can use the soft touches that Dr. Boucher suggests, great, but it's not going to get us all the way. And then the question we have to really decide is how harsh to be to get the last 30%. And it's going to be a difficult thing to decide on.
It's interesting. So it's really late for you there now. I hope you had a fun Bastille Day celebration, though, before you joined us. Dr. Vogler, this is a question for you from the audience about population growth in cities. And it's the question is, do you predict that population will grow in cities or the opposite will happen? And I know during the pandemic, a lot of people left New York and San Francisco, for example. And I guess this is a question about whether you think that this is sort of might lead to a reverse urbanization trend or not.
Yeah, so predicting the future is very difficult, and a lot of scientists have tried it in the past, and many of them have failed. So I will definitely not make a definitive prediction here.
Okay.
I will make one or a couple points actually. The first one is that urbanization is a very long-lasting trend and has been for decades. And I think that this trend is so strong that it will not be reversed, especially in settings like the United States, where we now have high vaccination rates. I assume the rest of the world will catch up soon. I think the trend of increasing urbanization is such a strong one, it will be very, very difficult to break it. And that is in part because urban centers are increasingly centers of knowledge. The knowledge economy, that is now the predominant form of economy in the United States, is located in urban centers. And urban centers, there's a huge income disparity between urban centers and rural areas. So I predict, at least that prediction I will make, that we will not see a complete break of that trend. Now, what I will say is that there might be a deceleration of that trend. And the reason is that what we have seen in the pandemic is it has revealed that at least for some jobs, it is possible to execute these jobs in a pretty good way from home. And as a consequence of that, many people have moved away from urban areas. Now, I think this will still be a minority, but I think it will lead to a deceleration of that trend, because we see that at least some people will make of that opportunity of working elsewhere. Some businesses will make of that use of that opportunity. I don't think it will become the predominant way of doing business, but it will mean an important addition to the way we traditionally did business. So again, I'm not making a definitive prediction, but that is dangerous. But these are my thoughts on the issue.
And I think we've seen too what we miss by not having that in-person interaction too. I mean, I think we can do our jobs, but is it the ideal way to do our jobs, especially when you want to have an exchange of ideas, which today is possible because it looks like we're scattered across the globe. But yeah, I think those are, those sort of casual in-person conversations are, I've definitely been missing out on those too. So Professor Haughton, I have a question. We have a question for you, and this is actually a very politically charged question, but I thought it was interesting. It's from our audience, and it's: do you think that continuing to pay extra weeks of unemployment benefits is a cause of people's reluctance to return to work? You addressed this a little bit, I think, before, but maybe you can dive a little deeper into it.
I think it is. I think the evidence shows that. The question is, do we care? Because all taxes, all benefits tend to alter behavior to some extent. And so we have to recognize that if we do provide people with a stronger safety net, some people will benefit from that. And it won't hustle as much to go back to work. It'll be less harsh, but so yes, I think that effect is there. And in a way, it doesn't do a service to deny that there's such an effect. I think we have to just face it that there is. Now, does it matter? Well, I think this is an interesting question, which is how long should we be willing to support people and at what level if they don't have work? What's interesting is that some countries that we think of as being very sort of socially enlightened, like Sweden, have fairly generous unemployment structures, but they really do insist that if you accept money while you're unemployed, that you look for a job, that you retrain, that you really are making that effort. And they accompany the payments to individuals with other types of support, which costs money too, but is just as necessary, because you want to help people get back, and there are often good reasons why they're not getting back into the labor force. And maybe they do need to retool or get a better looking CV or begin a different tactic for finding. We don't do a good job of supporting people in those ways. But from a pure point of view of the incentives, yeah, it does have some effect. Personally, that doesn't bother me in the slightest.
We have time for one more question, and we've gotten a few questions that are sort of in this general category. So I'm going to kind of try to lump them together a little bit. And this one's for Dr. Boucher about the political aspect of the response. And so, there have been a few questions about how the politics played into the pandemic response, but I kind of like this phrasing of the question, which is, if there's another pandemic, do you think politicians who didn't take COVID seriously this last year, is there hope that they will kind of take the next pandemic seriously? Or do you think that politics has made it so that it'll be really complicated to respond to this again in the future?
Oh, it's a great question. And I certainly don't pretend to have the absolute answer. But I think we've seen that in some ways science has prevailed, right? If we look at where we are 16 months in, people pretty much accept that masks work, physical distancing works. Some of these things that we were having trouble with in the beginning, I think the proof is in the pudding, and that having scientists and healthcare workers available to manage makes a difference. So I hope that some of those principles will prevail. I will point out that our system is still potentially problematic, right? The leadership changes with the politicians, right? The leaders in Washington are national leaders. And that is a bit of a liability, right? We have a CDC head who's a political appointee. You look at the way the government is structured. That is a bit of a liability. I will say that if you look today, most of our politicians respect the consequences of a disease like this, and predominantly for the economic reasons, right? It has cost our country in ways that are just not acceptable. So I hope that in some of these practicalities will guide sort of better response the next time.
And so you do feel hopeful, because one of the questions is about how we can make policy that gets beyond this politically charged label, because we know masks work, but they have been so charged, right? And you have hope that we can get beyond that.
I do. And I think that there are some structural things that can be done to help that, right? There are ways to put things like public health infrastructure into place that is not all dependent on appropriations in the political process, right? So to say that we're going to invest in this infrastructure in a way that is lasting and that can't be undone as easily by the political comings and goings. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things that's become so clear in this pandemic is just how information gets disseminated and processed and how. And one of the questions was about social media, but I was sort of doing a story about the CDC and how the science is sort of slower moving than the guidance in a way, and just and how they really struggled to, and we see that, not just with COVID, but with so many different recommendations they make, and just trying to make these broad recommendations for 350 million people in the country with maybe not perfect data. And that's such a hard process. And we saw so many organizations struggle through that this past year. So
yeah, well, there's the two issues, right? There's the communication issue and communicating clearly, and then there's the dealing with the uncertainty, and that's the nature of science. And so I think that that's been an issue that's been very challenging, and people are getting better at dealing with that. But just today, before this meeting, I was talking to a reporter about that very fact. So it's not gone away.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I know journalists are sort of in that too. So
15 months ago, there was a time when we were told that we should not wear masks.
Yes.
And then we were told we should. So, science itself is not, it evolves. And the public doesn't always find that easy to accept, or the doubts remain, and they linger a lot longer than the change in views.
Yeah, and it can be very confusing too. So, thank you so much to everybody tonight for joining us, all the people watching at home today, and thank you so much to our panelists, Jan and Jonathan and Helen. You were amazing. Thank you guys, and our students, so Jamie, Paulina, Adam, and Martin. Thank you for joining us as well. I'm going to send it back to Christina to close us out. But thanks again.
Thanks, Renuka. And I just want to echo your sentiments. What a fabulous discussion, and what a wonderful way to kick off this series of our next survey course for everyone. And thank you for being here tonight for our kickoff episode. Good night, everyone. And Jonathan, you get extra points for stamina and being up so late. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.